Raspberries are something that are quite easy to grow in the garden or on an allotment, but they do require a bit of prep to make sure that we do give them the best chance possible in order to have less issues with any pests and diseases further down the line. And we can also think about whether or not we want autumn raspberries or summer raspberries. With a handful of canes, we should be able to provide enough raspberries for the average family and not have to buy any in at all for fresh eating and also for making jams and freezing as well. I do have an established patch, but we are going to be moving those because we're rearranging the garden a bit, and also the storms took out the supports as well. So this gives me an opportunity to do that, but I don't know if I'm going to manage to do that within the time that is necessarily the best time to do it. So we're going to go through how to plant them, where is best to plant them, and how to prep the ground. But if I do manage to get mine done before the end of March, then I will definitely record that for you as well. So we move raspberries, or we plant raspberries when they're dormant, and that's anywhere between November and March. The difference between our summer and our autumn raspberries is to do with which of the canes, so whether they're the first year or the second year canes, that they actually fruit on. Autumn varieties are the ones that actually flower and fruit on the primo cane, so that's the first year's cane that's been put up. These are probably the easiest to maintain. They are also much more sturdy than our summer varieties and don't require as much support as the summer varieties, so they are much easier, in my opinion, to have a row of. Then we have our summer varieties, and these are the varieties that fruit on the second year canes or the florocanes. And these are the ones that are trimmed straight after fruiting rather than waiting until late winter. And then they do also need that much more support. They grow taller and they do need tying in around February time as well. So there is a little bit more work to these, but the ground prep for both of these is exactly the same. All raspberries are definitely going to enjoy a very sunny spot, but they will also manage in a slightly shaded area as well. We do want to avoid them being too windswept if possible, so a slightly sheltered spot will definitely help. But you do want to make sure that these have plenty of airflow, or you may find that in wetter summers that you end up with more fruits that are going to go mouldy and rot. They enjoy a slightly more acidic soil, but they will manage absolutely fine. And if your soil isn't acidic, then you could just do things like add a little bit of ericaceous compost when they're being mulched. And they definitely do not like their roots being wet. Now, we do want to keep them damp and they want to be well watered, so our UK climate is definitely really good for them, but they don't want to be sitting in a waterlogged area. So if you have a very clay soil, or you have soil that floods, particularly over winter, then you either want to raise them or we want to be dealing with this soil. If you are thinking that you're going to have problems with waterlogging, then the first thing we're going to think about is, at least to a spade depth, we're going to be adding some extra manure, some compost, some sand, or some grit and gravel, just to make sure that they are going to drain. If you think that this isn't going to be adequate, then actually building it into some sort of raised bed is going to really help as well, just to make sure that they're not going to sit in that water during any flooding that you may have. If you've got more sandy soil and maybe it dries out very quickly, then another thing that we can do is to add lots of organic matter. And even if you don't have any of these types of soil and your soil is very healthy, it's really worth digging in lots of organic matter before we plant these, just to make sure that these perennial plants are going to be sustained for years to come. Ideally, if you can, we want to be planting these north to south so they don't shade each other. If you are only planting one row, then this isn't necessarily going to be as much of a problem. If you're planting two, and then you really want to think about which way round they are facing if you can, and just avoid too much shading from trees and things like that as well. We don't want our raspberries actually competing with any perennial weeds as well, so it is going to be really important to make sure that you thoroughly dig out any perennial weeds and make sure that there isn't any issues going forward, because once these are established, it's going to be very difficult to remove them. Because they do pick up a lot of different viruses and issues, we also want to make sure that we are choosing a new area. So if you're on an allotment and there's any indication that there have been raspberries in that area before and you're just replacing them because they're not doing very well maybe, then it's definitely going to be a good idea to choose a new area, or you may find that you have similar issues with the new canes that are planted in that area. We also want to make sure that we build any supports, particularly for our summer varieties. And you may find if you're in a more exposed location that even for your autumn raspberries that you may want to get some supports in for those, but it wouldn't need to be as rigid as the support for the summer varieties. And then for the summer varieties, you're really looking at around a 2 foot support and then a 5 foot level of support as well. So you can tie those canes in when it's necessary. These canes are likely to grow a little bit taller than that, but at that point we can just tie them in and then trim them when it's a suitable point to do so. And we'll go over when that will be at a later date as well. Raspberry plants do also spread out considerably, so we want to make sure that we are planting them at a suitable distance. So we're looking at around 50 centimetres to 60 centimetres between each plant. And what we're going to find is that each of these crowns and each of these roots are going to be putting out suckers. So we want to be removing these so this area doesn't spread too much and we don't end up with raspberries further along. And I've got raspberries coming into the polytunnel and they're about a metre away currently than the edge of the polytunnel. So they do travel quite a distance. But as long as we deal with them quite quickly, then we shouldn't have any further issues with them. If you're doing more than one row, then we're looking at around 1.8 meters between each of the rows. This is to ensure that we have plenty of light, but also these are going to be quite bushy by the time that they're in leaf, and we need to make sure that we can get round these plants in order to pick them as well. When you are planting each of the canes, it's really important to make sure that they are at the same level as what they have been previously planted at. So if we plant them too deep, they are just not going to do very well and they're likely to die. So have a look at the plants that you've bought and have a look for the level that is already on there, making sure that we don't plant them any deeper than that. Once they have been planted, now it's time to add a mulch onto the top. So we're looking at around a 7 centimetre deep mulch, and you ideally to begin with don't want to actually use manure because this could cause some burning with the new canes. That's fine when we're more established, but at the moment anything like compost and things like that is definitely going to be a lot better. Once they're planted, we're going to then look at pruning them down to around 25 centimetres. The only time that we do not want to do this is if we have bought longer canes in order for them to fruit sooner. So if you then chop those down, you're going to take off that advantage that you've got. But for your normal canes, we do want to chop these down. That's going to encourage these plants to put up new canes and really get established and healthy. We are going to make sure that these are well watered as well when they are initially planted, and also make sure that we continue to water them during dry periods. Once they are established, I tend to find that the only time that I do it is during a drought. Otherwise, you in usual circumstances will have wet enough soil, and the mulching that we add to the top after we trim these will also help retain that moisture as well. So we do obviously have some issues that we've spoken about already with disease and pests that are likely to cause problems with the raspberries. But if we've set them up correctly, then hopefully we're going to reduce that as much as possible. There are certain issues with canes dying or not looking very healthy, and at that point we just want to remove them as quickly as we can. The main issue that we're going to find initially is with birds. So if you do have the ability to have them in a fruit cage, then that is definitely worth doing. But if you don't, then I find that the birds will eat some, but they'll leave plenty for us. And we don't actually keep them covered. If you are going to keep them covered, or maybe you've got pigeons that are going to cause a lot more issues than we have around here, then make sure that that net is very, very well secured and that the birds aren't going to get tangled in it. Viruses that we deal with usually with raspberries are often actually caused by sucking insects and things like aphids. So one thing that we don't want to do necessarily is use older canes or canes that other people have given us. These may not actually be disease resistant. So it is worth buying newer ones unless they are absolutely certain that their established bushes are healthy. So it's definitely worth thinking about if you've been given some before you put them in the ground, because you may just spread issues that you don't need. Other issues that we may find with these is things like magnesium deficiencies, which are going to change the colour of the leaves to a very yellow. Hopefully we will manage this by feeding them correctly, and we'll have a look at that later on in the year. And then also grey mould as well, which can be something that affects the canes, but particularly it will affect the berries and they just turn to mush. There is nothing that we can do about this except for removing any of that unhealthy growth. But if we make sure that we maintain these correctly, then we shouldn't need to worry about these too much. So these are an autumn variety of canes that I bought. So these are what we would consider as bare root canes. So these have just been popped in together. So there's 5 or 6 canes, I think 5 canes here, that are just popped into a bit of compost in order for them to be sold and transported. So you may find that yours arrive like this in a bucket, or yours may come with just a plastic bag and a tiny bit of soil on the bottom. And that's absolutely fine. It's the cheapest way to buy them. And what we need to make sure that we do though is that these 5 canes are separated and planted individually rather than planted together. These are the bushes that we're going to use, so I managed to pick these up locally in the end, and they were 2 for £20. So the puppy's already started breaking bits off, but you'll see that there's some shoots coming on some of them as well. These are, as I said, a summer variety, so we'll be actually looking at trimming these slightly different than the others. And then these are the pots that I'm going to be putting them into. These are 35-litre pots. They're 40 centimetres wide by about 37 centimetres deep. I will put the link for the information in the caption for these, because they're really quite heavy duty, more sturdy and cheaper than, say, your decorative pots of this size as well. They're the perfect size for what we're doing today. We're looking really for at least 38 centimetres wide and about 30 centimetres deep. So they will be just the job for these. And then this compost here is actually a mixture of spent compost. So spent compost is compost that you've used for previous crops last year, and that it's just not got as much nutrients. And then to that I've mixed in some Rocket Grow Magic Mulch, which is a slow release feed, and then also a handful of bloodfish and bone. So we're just going to use this to fill these buckets. And once we've got so far full, we're just going to pop the pot in and continue adding the compost around the edge. Once we've got the compost around the same height as the compost in the pot, you should just be able to slide out your pot, turn it upside down, a little slug on the bottom there. Just gently loosen any of those roots at the bottom and lower it into the hole. It is very important that we don't end up with any of the raspberry crowns lower than they were previously. And then the next thing I'm going to do is just loosen any of those weeds along the top, just to stop them establishing. Be careful not to actually upset any new shoots. Any parts that are looking healthy and fine, we don't need to trim at all. But if you've got any parts that are looking unhealthy, like this one here that has probably once again been got by the puppy, just cut it back to the next shoot. And then that is all we need to do currently for this one. If you have any raspberry canes that you can't get in the ground for the foreseeable future, so you can't prep it, you bought them but you want to do something with them, if they're autumn varieties, they can be planted exactly the same as this, and they should do well in tubs this sort of size, but you'd only want to put 1 cane per tub. As these do prefer slightly more acidic soil than a lot of plants, one of the things that's going to really benefit these as well ongoing is if you can provide them with some rainwater rather than tap water. They will have been kept outside before they've been purchased, so there's absolutely no reason to keep them inside or protected from anything particularly. We do have a lot of wind at the moment, so I'm just going to keep them behind the polytunnel for a couple of days just to get them used to their new position, and then they can be moved into an area that hopefully is a little bit protected. But because these are bushes rather than canes, they're not going to get too tall, so it's not something we need to worry about as much. Then finally, we just want to make sure that we label them as well.